Good morning, Synod. Please be seated. First, we have an announcement from the Chair of the Business Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. In view of the large amendments of item 520 this morning, and also the importance of the following item 7, the Loyal Address, I'd like to propose, Madam Chair, that a rubric of no later than 11:35 be inserted before item 7, which will ensure that we do take this item of business during this morning's sessions.
That has my consent. Does it have your consent, Synod? Thank you very much. I also have a note from the staff about microphones. When speaking from the podiums, please make sure that you are speaking towards the microphone and not too much above it, or below it, or to the side. As you can see, the microphones are robust, and therefore please do adjust them to make sure you are speaking into them, and that will help with audibility in the hall and for those on Zoom. Thank you. We now come to item 510. It's the Diocesan Boards of Education Measure 2021, consequential amendment to regulations under Canon B12, Regulations 2023, GS 2285. As well as Order Paper 1, members will need the regulations and explanatory notes, GS 2285X. I invite the Chair of the Legislative Reform Committee, Canon Simon Butler, to move item 510. He has up to 10 minutes.
Good morning, Synod. This is peak geek moment, so great way to start the day by going full geek. The Diocesan Boards of Education Measure 2021, consequential amendments to regulations under Canon B12 of Regulations 2023. Some of you will know that the Church Assembly was the precursor to General Synod, and I'm told by a member of the staff that Alan Don, who was then chaplain to Archbishop Cosmo Gordon-Lang, wrote in his diary in February 1932 the following words: "Church Assembly, not very invigorating." Well, of course, this is the moment you've all been waiting for, and the peak of my synodical career, to propose to you. That bit is true. Thank you, Archbishop. To propose to you the Diocesan Boards of Education Measure 2021, open brackets, consequential amendments to regulations under Canon B12, close brackets, and Regulations 2023. Canon B12 provides that the General Synod may from time to time make regulations concerning who may administer Holy Communion, and Synod did that in 2015. And one of the places where Holy Communion is regularly administered is in our church schools. And that is, of course, a crucial part of our ministry and mission. In paragraph 5 of those 2015 regulations, there's a definition of church school which refers to the Diocesan Boards of Education Measure 1991. It also provides that the head teacher includes an acting head teacher. Synod will remember, and the Archbishop is clearly remembering as I speak, that we, in 2021, passed a new Diocesan Boards of Education measure. And a consequence of this is that the references in the 2015 regulations are now out of date. So the 2021 measure provided for new definitions of church school and head teacher. And of course, it's important that the regulations made under Canon B12 refer to the most up-to-date definitions. And so, to fix all of this, these regulations before you for approval make consequential amendments to provide that the terms church school and head teacher each have the same meaning as in the new Diocesan Boards of Education Measure 2021. They do no more than that. It's a bit of tidying up. So, Synod, we have to do this sort of thing so our laws make sense and are coherent, and that when we do make changes, all the changes that follow are done and tidied up. So I ask you to please approve these regulations, to pick up some time if we don't need too much debate. They are important, they do relate to our mission and ministry, and at very least, the people sitting behind me, the lawyers, will be very happy indeed. I beg to move the motion standing in my name.
This item is now open for debate. The speech limit is 3 minutes. I see people standing, but they're not indicating they wish to speak. They're just finding a seat. So I see no one wishing to speak to this. So I now put item 510 to a vote. The question is that the Diocesan Boards of Education Measure 2021, consequential amendment to regulations under Canon B12, Regulations 2023, be approved. All in favour, please show. Thank you. All against, please show. That is clearly carried. The regulations have been approved, and that concludes this item of business.
Good morning, Synod. We come now to item 509, the report by the Revision Committee on the draft Church of England Miscellaneous Provisions Measure and draft amending Canon number 43. Members will need the report of the Revision Committee and the draft measure and canon. You also need order paper number 2. And we heard from the Chair of the Business Committee about the timed adjournment at 11:35, so we're working towards that. Obviously, these kind of miscellaneous provisions measure are a complex kind of melange of bits and pieces. That's their purpose. So it's much more fascinating than the name suggests. Believe me. And one of the changes that you'll notice is that those who are proposing amendments, if there is a debate on it, they now have a right of reply. So if you're proposing an amendment, then you get 3 minutes at the end to have your say, which is a good thing, I think. Yeah. So please bear that in mind, and also bear in mind, members of Synod, that as a legislative body, this is our chance to scrutinise legislation. So it's important that whatever the processes seem to be like and however fast they seem to be going, that we take that opportunity. So I'm now going to call the Chair of the Revision Committee, the Venerable Nicky Groarke, to move the motion that the Synod do take note of this report. And Archdeacon, you have up to 10 minutes to do so.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Synod. Nicky Groarke, Worcester 236. On reading papers in preparation for this session, which I'm sure you have all undertaken with due diligence, you may have wondered why such a random array of topics are grouped together in this way. Miscellaneous is the right word here, as what unites this disparate parade is that they are all useful and practical reforms of a kind that can only be made by legislation, and none of them would merit an entire canon or measure all by themselves. So this is a convenient way for us to gather up a bunch of much-needed reforms and deal with them reasonably quickly and efficiently. The miscellaneous provisions measure and amending canon number 43 therefore mark key steps forward in the Church's mission. Before going further, I want to thank the steering committee, the other members of the revision committee, the brilliant Synod legal team, and those members who made submissions. The revision committee met twice and received 19 submissions. I believe that between us we have significantly improved the drafts which Synod approved at first consideration in July 2022. Turning first to the measure, I will take the clauses one by one and summarise our decisions, reminding you of history as appropriate. Clause 1 makes two changes to our hybrid meetings. This measure passed through its synodical stages in a single day in a special session summoned for that purpose on the 24th of September 2020, amidst the challenging times of ongoing lockdowns. Synod then rejected an amendment to bring Article 7 or 8 business into the scope of the provision, despite there being some support for that, because of concerns about the significance of that business and fear that it could not be properly dealt with remotely. But experience has shown that hybrid meetings are immensely valuable. The vast majority of members choose to remove the sunset clause. Some members felt now was too soon to remove it, but we think enough time has passed now to make the measure permanent, and it is easier to do so in this measure than by a separate parliamentary procedure. It will still, of course, be scrutinised by Parliament when it considers this measure as a whole. Clause 3 is new. Synod will no longer have to approve revisions to the Safeguarding Code of Practice, which are insubstantial or provide guidance rather than new requirements. Clause 4 is also new. Synod will no longer have to approve a change in name of a suffragan see, but will still have to approve a change in name of a diocese. Clause 5 amends the terms of service regulations to make modest improvements to common tenure. There were no submissions on Clause 6 on delegating bishops' functions. Clause 7 creates a new ecclesiastical office, the lay residentiary canon. The committee decided by a majority to support this new role, given the desirability of equality, where possible, between lay and ordained ministry. We did, though, agree an important restriction that a person should be appointed a lay residentiary canon only if they have at least 6 years' experience as a reader or lay worker. There were no submissions on Clause 8 on bishops' mission orders. Clause 9 is new. It gives the Diocesan Board of Patronage the right of patronage where the registered patron is disqualified. On Clause 10 on ecclesiastical judges, we received a submission not to increase their retirement age to 75, which is when secular judges retire. But we saw no reason to treat ecclesiastical judges differently. We received no submissions on Clauses 11 to 13 on court procedure. On Clause 14 on the care of churches, one member asked how the new duty to regard environmental matters would work alongside the existing duty to have regard to the church's purpose. We thought this did not need spelling out and could be assessed case by case. Also on Clause 14, Synod should note new subsection 4, which requires each DAC to have at least one member with experience of accessibility issues. On Clause 15, on disposals of church land, some members felt that where a benefice is vacant, the PCC, not the bishop, should take on the incumbent's role in land transactions. But the committee noted that the bishop must already give consent in land transactions, so it makes sense to give the bishop overall responsibility where there is a vacancy. Clause 16 deals with the care of cathedrals, in particular the procedure for a cathedral put any of its objects of special interest on display. There were no submissions on Clause 17, which brings our legislation into line with charity law on some procedural property matters. On Clause 18, on elections, the committee received two notable submissions. First, that a close relative should not be able to nominate a person as a candidate in parochial elections. And second, that elections should include the option of reopening nominations so that a person can vote for none of the above if they dislike all the candidates. The committee strongly supported the first submission, but recognised it was best for the Elections Review Group to consider the point in depth. We also referred the second submission to the ERG, who have agreed to consider both points promptly. Clause 9 amends the Church Commissioner's procedures to reflect the usual practice for a large charity dealing with complex financial transactions. Some members queried the need to allow the commissioners to delegate functions to a subcommittee. They were, though, reassured to note that the clause already imposes the same procedural safeguards on delegations to subcommittees as it does on committees. Clause 20 is new. Where the see of one archbishop is vacant, the joint power of the archbishops to make appointments to the pensions board will instead be exercisable by the other archbishop. Clause 21 is also new. Church bodies will be able to hold remote or hybrid meetings in the same way Synod does. Clause 22 is new, being a drafting amendment that brings into one place the synodical procedure for making orders under the measure. Clause 23 contains standard provisions on commencement and extent. We also received a submission from the former Bishop of Blackburn seeking new powers for bishops following safeguarding risk assessments. We established a subcommittee to look at this, and they advised there is a serious need to address this, but it's not feasible to do that now, given the policy and legal work required. We stress our view that this must be progressed urgently. That concludes the measure, and I now come to amending Canon 43. Paragraphs 1 to 4 are new and respond to the recent demise of the Crown. There were no submissions on paragraph 5 on services in parish churches. Paragraphs 6 and 7 amend the canons on marriage following the recent change in secular law to increase the minimum age for marriage from 16 to 18. We received submissions that the amendments are unnecessary, but we felt it was right to update the canons to reflect changes in the general law. The fact that there is now an inconsistency between the age of consent and the minimum age for marriage is a matter for Parliament and not something the canons can solve. Paragraph 8 makes consequential amendments on lay residentiary canons. Paragraph 9 enables an archdeacon to delegate to a deputy other than a rural dean. We were satisfied that the delegation was necessarily confined to clergy. There were no submissions on paragraphs 10 to 15, which make technical amendments. That concludes amending canon number 43. I appreciate some of the points I've covered may seem dry and technical, dull even, compared to some other items on Synod's agenda. But I do emphasise to Synod that although it won't make the front pages on the national press, this legislation matters. It is the means for us to bring about important changes on how Synod conducts business. It reforms our structures by creating lay residentiary canons, and it makes further strides in simplification. I beg to move that Synod do take note of this report.
Thank you. The motion is now open for debate. I remind members that under Standing Order 57.6, it is not in order to debate a matter which is the subject of an amendment on the order paper. Those wishing to speak should stand or indicate, and the speech limit will begin at 5 minutes. Father Benfield, and then gentleman there. Thank you.
Paul Benfield, Blackburn 66. I appeared in front of this revision committee, and I have to say I didn't find it a very satisfactory procedure. That's nothing to do with the membership of the committee and how it was conducted, except that it was conducted online. And I think there was less discussion than there would have been if we'd met in person. And I just put a note down that in future could consideration be given for such committees meeting in person. Otherwise, I fear that we will end up with a larger number of amendments on the floor of Synod because people feel that their point has not been properly heard or understood in the revision committee.
Thank you. Gentleman here. Clive Scowen.
Fraser Oates, Worcester 238. Thank you for calling me. Just in relation to the BMO measure, item 8. In section 82 of the Mission and Pastoral Measure 2011, the initiation and continuation of a BMO rests heavily upon the opinion, I quote, opinion of a bishop. Of course, this allows for freedom and creativity in mission and scope for experimental and innovative projects which the Church needs. But it appears somewhat precarious that a BMO, including associated stipends, pensions, property, licenses, employees and finances, rests predominantly upon one person's opinion. What would be more reassuring here, considering the termination of licenses and other potential risks, would be a more rigorous safety net of accountability, discernment and protection for BMOs and those involved in them. I appreciate Clause 4 of Section 8 refers to the consultative role of the Diocesan Mission and Pastoral Committee, but it seems to be rather vague and open to some misuse, particularly considering people's lives, vocations and families are bound up in this. I encourage Synod to take note of this report, but I would ask the committee for a more robust review of the BMO provisions and processes. Thank you.
Mr. Scowen and then the lady in blue at the back.
Clive Scowen, London 358. Just want to say a word about the proposals for changing the requirements for elections at APCMs, which Nicky Gort referred to. I'm the chair of the Elections Review Group to whom this knotty problem has been referred, and we always like a knotty problem to deal with. I just want to assure Synod that we are indeed undertaking this promptly. We're planning to start looking at it at our March meeting, and we hope we may be able to bring some proposal on this to Synod in July. I'm not promising that, but that is our hope at this moment.
Thank you. The lady over there, after this speech, I'll reduce it to 3 minutes, although people have been really good. Gentleman there, thank you.
Rebecca Chapman, Southwark 414. Thank you for calling me, Chair. I want to thank the Revision Committee for their work on this, and to particularly thank them for their comments on trust, which appeared several times in their report. Trust, that ephemeral thing which, like respect or reputation, takes years to build and can be destroyed in seconds. But one person's lack of trust is another person's appropriate checks and balances. And it's important to remember the reason that these checks and balances are here for multiple safeguards or added friction, depending on your perspective. When things work well, all manner of things shall be well. But checks and balances are there explicitly to prevent the abuse of power when things go wrong, to put limits on how much damage a misguided or even a malicious person can do with unchecked power. As a legislative body, we need to consider, unfortunate as it seems and unholy as it can appear, what is the worst that could possibly happen and how do we prevent that? We pray and we hope for the best, but we must recognise that we in the Church are all human, all flawed, all broken, and ask what limits must be put in place to prevent an abuse of power in the worst of circumstances and not just in the best. In the Church, it can sometimes seem like this trust is slipping away, as seen in this report is just one example, and we need to recognise that. As we recognise that lack of trust, we can work to rebuild it. And however tempting it might be, our response shouldn't be to say, we know what we're doing, you should just trust us, but to build bridges across the divide and seek to rebuild. As Jesus empowered us broken and flawed humans to build his church, he had that servant leadership which gave away all power. So we too should be empowering those at all levels of our church. I encourage Synod to take note of this report and to take note in particular its comments on trust. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman there, and then you, sir, and the speech limit is now 3 minutes.
Tim Bateman, Birmingham, number 63. I also want to speak into the Bishop's Mission or Determination of Licence, Section 8. I want to suggest we take note of the report, but that the consultation be taken a bit further by the revision committee. One of the churches we planted last year as a BMO has grown to roughly 140 to 150 people, meeting each week, bustling with children, young people, and people coming to faith. They now have staff working too on this location. The proposal to terminate a BMO with immediate notice puts BMOs like these clearly where God is doing something incredible, building a thriving Christian community, reaching out to the local area. It puts these under unnecessary pressure with little legal protection. Although I completely agree a bishop or their delegated team should have the right to terminate BMOs, my suggestion is that this proposal needs more consultation. More thought could be put into a sensible time frame of the termination period rather than it being immediate. Church leaders going into these contexts need the security and support backing them, as well as their staff and congregations, that this is something that is supported and that planting and pioneering is a risk worth taking. They need to know that their jobs aren't going to be pulled with immediate effect. With this support, it could impact mental health of clergy and staff with no protections, as we all care about here at General Synod. Planting and the establishment of new worshiping communities is a courageous thing in itself, but not having the infrastructure to support them will inhibit this happening when we're in desperate need to reach our nation. So let's not make it harder than it is already, and I'd really encourage the revision committee to consider this a little bit further. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gentleman there, and then Pat Hawkins.
Matt Beer, Lichfield 143. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. I must declare an interest as I hold a Bishop's Mission Order licence. I can see the need to withdraw Bishop's Mission Orders, either with or without consultation, should things go disastrously wrong. Whilst broadly accepting this measure, there seems to be little or no protection for clergy who hold Bishop's Mission Orders. There seems also to be no or little protection for lay staff who are working under a Bishop's Mission Order. Where the Synod has asked about clergy and laity welfare, should there be further work carried out in consultation with BMO leaders within this revision committee? As these revisions continue to leave BMOs and churches in a precarious position without accurate safeguards in place, therefore, what I'd ask the revision committee to please consult with BMOs as they take this forward. Please could we take note of this debate, but further work and consultation needs to take place within this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Pat Hawkins, and then the prosecutor.
Pat Hawkins, Lichfield 145. I want to speak just briefly to the question about hybrid meetings, and to do so as the chair of our DAC, which is committed to working hybridly. And I have no objection to what's proposed here and will vote in favour. But I just want to make a couple of comments about, if we're committed to hybrid meetings, how we actually work with them. As the chair of our DAC, I've sometimes felt like a medium, carrying messages from one side of the veil to the other. Archbishop, I've never been a medium. But I think there is an issue about how we, meeting in physical presence, engage with those who are joining us virtually. And I also take Father Benfield's point about what happens, particularly where you get stuck in a meeting, about the conversations that happen, as it were, off-piste, and how that feeds into the discussion. Now, this is probably not strictly the business of the revision committee, but I couldn't think where else to raise it, and I think it is just worth flagging up.
Thank you, the prosecutor, and then.
Luke Miller, 163 London. Just a word on the BMOs. I am the visitor to a number of BMOs, And as Synod will know, we did some work a few years ago now in order to ensure that those who worship in Bishops' Mission Orders have synodical representation. And so there are a number of synodical bits to unpick if a BMO were to be closed down, especially if that were to happen suddenly. Mr. Scowen will tell us all about how that would affect your deanery synods. And so I would just draw the Revision Committee's attention to the role of the visitor and the report that the visitor can make into the life of the BMO and the consultation that could therefore take place to enable, where it were necessary to shut a BMO, for that not to take place suddenly with the consequences which other speakers have pointed to.
Thank you. Neil Patterson.
Neil Patterson, Hereford 130. It's just a kind of response coming to my head to the various BMO clergy, and maybe laity as well, who we've just heard standing. And I suppose this is a bit of a thing about legislation in Synod. The draft measure was proposed at a previous set of sessions. It was available. We could all read it. It could be spotted that the then Clause 6 referred to BMOs and made this provision which people have reasonable comments about. No submissions were received by the Revision Committee, of which I was a member, that anything should change in that clause, so it stands unamended in the draft measure. We are now at the revision stage, and no revisions have been proposed by any of the people who are concerned about it. And so we are faced with the dilemma of whether or not to hold up the whole measure. I defer to the steering committee as to perhaps what they wish to do with it, but it's just a thought for everyone. If read legislation when it comes in first draft, find out then whether there's something important about it and work out how to contribute to its development. It's complicated to do so at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. I see no one standing, so I call on Archdeacon Nicky to respond to the debate. And Nicky, you have up to 5 minutes to do so.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, thank you to Father Benfield and Pat Hawkins for their comments on hybrid meetings. I have to admit that I sometimes hate Zoom meetings. I'm sure we all do, but they have made it possible to gather people from all over the country to have very efficient meetings. And I couldn't have chaired the revision committee if we hadn't been meeting on Zoom purely for time. So it's not perfect, but it does enable accessibility and much more efficient use of business. Lots of concerns raised on BMOs from Fraser, Tim, Matt, and thank you, Luke, as well. I've been asked to point out that there is also a general review of the Mission and Pastoral Measure 2011, which focuses on this quite a lot more than we've been able to. Please use the synodical processes to feed into that revision process. As Neil said, this is an opportunity to do so. It's only a small part of this business, but you do have another stab at it. So I would encourage all of those of you who've raised very valid concerns to feed them into that process. We want to protect you, but we also want to keep the freedom and creativity. Mr. Scowen, I'm very glad that the ERG likes a knotty problem. We thought that was a good knotty problem to pass on to you, and we hope you have much fun in unravelling it. And Rebecca, thank you for noting the comments on trust. Trust came up quite a lot in our conversations, and picking up that there were times when people were not quite sure they trusted the process. We need to get better at it, and we thought it was important to raise that. There are checks and balances needed, so keep an eye on that, and let's try and build trust with one another. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I now put item 509 to the vote. All those in favour, please indicate. Thank you. All those against? That is clearly carried. We come now to the revision stage for the draft measure. Members should note that the revision stage for the draft amending canon AC 43 will take place tomorrow. Because the report of the revision committee related to both a measure and a canon, under Standing Order 57.4a, which is a new standing order, I must call first on a member of the revision committee to move that the draft Church of England miscellaneous provisions measure do proceed to the revision stage. I call on the chair of the steering committee, Mr. Stephen Hoffmeyer to move that motion.
Stephen Hoffmeyer, Guildford 320. I move that motion.
Thank you. That's lovely. The standing orders require me to put this motion to a vote without debate, and so I will do that now. I'm reading off the page if you think it doesn't sound like me. I will do that now. So all those in favour, please show, indicate. Thank you. All those against? That is clearly carried. We will now proceed with the revision stage for the draft measure. We will need to make use of the 25-member procedure in Standing Order 59. Where an amendment is moved by someone other than a member of the steering committee and is not simply consequential on an amendment that has already been passed, the mover has not more than 5 minutes to speak to it. After the mover has spoken, I will then call on the chair of the steering committee to speak for not more than 5 minutes in reply. If the steering committee supports the amendment or indicates that, although it does not support the amendment, it nevertheless wishes the debate to continue, the debate on the amendment continues. Otherwise, the amendment will lapse unless 25 members stand in their places, or if unable to do so, indicate by some other means, or if you're on Zoom by using the green tick, that they wish the debate to continue or a vote to be taken. If that's not made any sense, it will become clear as we go through this, I hope to me, as much as to anybody else. We begin with clause 1 of the measure. I invite Mr. Clive Scowen to move his amendment to that clause, item 521. Clive, you may speak for not more than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Scowen, London 358. Those who were members in the last, what turned out to be sexennium, will remember that when we passed the remote meetings measure in the middle of the pandemic, it was decided, as has already been referred to exclude Article 7 and Article 8 business from what could be considered at a fully remote meeting. And the reason was that those matters that are considered under Article 7 and Article 8 tend to be difficult, often complex, often sensitive issues, which would be very difficult to debate entirely online. And that was the judgment that was made at the time, and in my view, it was a correct judgment. But that same measure also enabled us to have hybrid meetings, and of course now, all meetings are hybrid. It seems to work reasonably well. And so we clearly need to do something about what's in the original remote meetings measure if we're ever going to be able to take Article 7 and Article 8 business. Now, the draft measure seeks to remove the restrictions on taking Article 7 and 8 business in respect of all remote meetings, whether they're hybrid or fully remote. Now, what my amendment seeks to do is to provide that Article 7 and 8 business can be taken at hybrid meetings when the majority of people, I'm suggesting 2/3, are gathered in a single place, but not at fully remote meetings. Now, thus far, in the hybrid meetings we've always had, I think, in excess of 80% of those present, actually present together in the chamber, with the rest online. So it seems to me that the 2/3 threshold that I'm suggesting should not create a problem in practice. But I do believe that we need to continue the exclusion of Article 7 and 8 business from fully remote meetings. Now, you may say, well, why worry about that? We're not doing that anymore. Well, who knows what might be needed in the future? We're not doing it at the moment. I hope we will never, ever need to do a fully remote meeting again. Those who took part in them will know how unsatisfactory they were, albeit necessary. But who knows? There might be another pandemic. There might be some other situation arising that we have not even contemplated, which necessitated us to meet entirely online. And so what I'm really asking for is a middle way, between either full exclusion or no exclusion of Article 7 and 8 business, so that we can do this business at our hybrid meetings, as we need to be able to do, without risking the possibility that if we needed fully remote meetings in the future, that they could be taken there as well. So I beg to move the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Scowen. I now call Mr. Hofmeyr to speak for not more than 5 minutes in reply.
Thank you, Chair. I will share the burden of dealing with these various amendments with one of my colleagues on the steering committee, the Archdeacon of Totnes, the Venerable Douglas Detmer. But let me deal with this first. Clause 1, as you know, amends the remote meetings measure, which was passed in 2020 during the height of the COVID pandemic, and it enables General Synod to meet and to conduct business remotely, including on a hybrid basis, on a temporary basis. It was intended as a temporary expedient. It provided for the making of temporary standing orders for remote meetings. The temporary standing orders expired and have had to be revived by Synod. However, as matters stand, they can only be revived for a further temporary period. We don't currently have power to put in place permanent provision for hybrid meetings. During the debate in February of last year, there seemed to be strong support for some permanent provision to be made so that it would be possible for Synod meetings to continue to take place on at least a hybrid basis. That would ensure that those members who are unable to attend a physical meeting, for example for medical reasons, will nevertheless be able to participate as fully as possible in the Synod's business. And Clause 1 of this draft measure therefore amends the remote meetings measure so that standing orders for remote or hybrid meetings can continue in operation indefinitely if the Synod wishes that to be the case. The remote meetings measure also currently excludes two types of business, known as Article 7 and Article 8 business, from being considered at a remote or hybrid meeting. Article 7, as you know, concerns matters of doctrine and worship. Article 8 includes the making of changes to the services of baptism and Holy Communion, or in the ordinal, and the making of certain ecumenical schemes. Article 7 and Article 8 is subject to special procedure safeguards. Well, when the remote meetings measure was passed, we had no experience of hybrid meetings, but in the view of many, remote and hybrid meetings have been quite successful, and there is a good case for hybrid arrangements for members who need them. But as I've said, we can't do that on an indefinite basis if certain important types of business are excluded from consideration when a meeting takes place on a remote or hybrid basis. And Clause 1 of the measure would therefore remove the exclusion of Article 7 and 8 business from such meetings. Mr. Scowen has proposed an amendment which would qualify that exclusion. The qualification he proposes is that Article 7 and 8 business may only be considered at a hybrid meeting if at least 2/3 of those attending are present in person. The Revision Committee has unanimously rejected this qualification for two reasons. First, the Revision Committee were of the view that the measure had enabled a new and helpfully flexible approach on which Synod would continue to be able to rely even after the pandemic was over, and that it should be empowered to rely on this flexibility in an unrestricted way. First reason. Second, and related to the first, emergency legislation would be required should we enter into a period with restrictions similar to those imposed at the height of the COVID pandemic to enable Synod to deal with Article 7 and Article 8 business. We consider this to be an unnecessary and unhelpful restriction given the confidence which is built in hybrid meetings. And so for these reasons, we would invite you to reject the amendment.
Thank you. The steering committee does not support the amendment. Therefore, if you, Synod, wish it to be debated, I have to see 25 members standing or indicating or using the green tick if you're online. There are 25 members standing, so this amendment is now open for debate. Debbie Buggs, you have 3 minutes, Debbie.
Thank you. Debbie Buggs, London 353. Imagine with me that Mr. Scone's dire prediction comes to pass. There's another pandemic, and in the room there are 20 people, and on that small screen on the desk there are 300 people. It makes it very difficult for the 20 people in here to generate a decent atmosphere, and the only person who can see those 300 people is the chair. That's a very difficult position to be in. So that is why I support Clive's amendment.
Father Benfield, 3 minutes.
Paul Benfield, Blackburn 66. I'd just like to say that by its nature, Article 7 and Article 8 business can never be very urgent, so we can delay consideration of that business until we are able to meet more of us in person. So I would support Mr. Scone's amendment.
The lady over there. And
Ruth Abernethy, 407 Channel Islands, Guernsey. I wish to speak against the amendment. My concerns do not relate to how easy it is or is not to debate things over Zoom. I attended this session of meetings last year on Zoom following surgery and found it quite satisfactory, although not as good as being here in person. My point relates to whether this offers those members among us who wish to use procedure to undermine debate another opportunity. It seems to me that most of our meetings, if not all going forward, will be hybrid meetings. We therefore all have the choice to participate either through being in this room or through Zoom, and you are able to switch from one to the other during sessions. That would mean if there were a matter put up for debate that were controversial and a group did not wish to debate that point, they could simply exit this chamber, request that their voting be switched to Zoom, stand on the street outside to ensure that not 2/3 of the people currently logged on to the meeting or present at the meeting were in the chamber, and therefore thwart the debate entirely. And I don't think that's a reasonable thing for us to be putting through. We all intend to be here in person if we can, and I think in good faith we should be here if we can. And I don't think, therefore, this amendment is necessary. As I said, I think it offers the opportunity to those who may wish to use procedure to undermine debate another tool in their toolbox. And I therefore request that people consider rejecting this amendment. Thank you.
I see no one now standing. Under Standing Order 57 has recently been amended to give the mover an amendment, as I said at the beginning, to legislation the right to speak in reply for not more than 3 minutes. So I invite Mr. Scone to speak for no more than 3 minutes in reply, Clive.
Just want to make it very clear, if it hasn't been already, that my amendment is not aimed at making difficulty for hybrid meetings. I agree, hybrid meetings have thus far been a great success, and I do want us to be able to take Article 7 and 8 business at hybrid meetings. My concern is with trying to do such business at fully remote meetings, and that's why I want to qualify the change that's being made by the draft measure. Now, I confess I hadn't thought of the sort of Machiavellian approach. I'm not sure standing in the street's going to help, because I'm not sure they're going to be online, are they? But anyhow, perhaps they are. But all our procedures are open to abuse in all sorts of ways. On the whole, most of us don't do that, and I hope we won't. But it seems to me that that sort of fear of something like that being done is not a good basis for empowering Article 7 and 8 business to be done at fully remote meetings, when it will be very difficult to have a proper debate on what may well be a sensitive and complex, or both, issue. So that's what I'm asking Synod to focus on. Do you continue to share the judgment that Synod formed back in 2020 when it imposed this restraint on what could be taken at a fully remote meeting? If you think we were right then I invite you to vote for this amendment. If you don't, well, don't. But that's what I'm seeking to achieve.
Thank you, Clive. I now put item 521 to the vote. All those in favour of the amendment, please show. Thank you. All those against? Put your hands down, please. That was a bit too close to call on that, so I'm going to order a vote, a recorded vote of the Synod. You'll need a machine and your card for this. This is a counted vote of the whole Synod on item 521. Those present at Church House using the voting handsets and who wish to vote in favour of the amendment should press 1. Those against should press 2. Those who wish to record an abstention should press 3. Those participating remotely, you should use the online voting platform and vote or register an abstention using the buttons on the screen.
The voting period is open and will end in 1 minute. The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has ended.
There voted in favour 127, against 161, with 6 abstentions recording, therefore the amendment is lost. We now therefore come to item 522, that clause 1 stand part of the measure. As no member has indicated a wish to speak against it, item 522 is deemed to be carried. Mr. Carl Fender has given notice of his intention to speak against clause 2. So I call Mr. Hoffmeyer to move item 523, that clause 2 stand part of the measure. He may speak for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fender is inviting you to reject clause 2, and I cannot fault him for consistency. He raised his concerns about clause 2 at first consideration at the July sessions. The concern was repeated to the revision committee, and Mr. Fender is repeating his concern again today. The revision committee has not been persuaded and has voted to retain clause 2. Clause 2 makes another important change to legislation that concerns the way in which Synod conducts some of its business. The Legislative Reform Measure 2018 enables the Synod to make legislative reform orders. These orders are used to amend measures and other primary legislation to remove or reduce burdens that result from that legislation. Some 3 legislative reform orders have been made since 2018 and have resulted in the removal of a significant number of administrative and financial burdens. The legislative reform measure contains a sunset clause. The power to make legislative reform orders will expire in March 2024 unless it is extended. The legislative reform measure itself provides for extension by way of a special order made with the approval of the General Synod and both Houses of Parliament. However, the same result can be achieved by including in this draft measure removing the sunset provision. That seems a more convenient and efficient way of extending the power to make legislative reform orders. It will save time and expense and will avoid the need to obtain parliamentary time for a separate affirmative order. The important point, Synod, to remember is that General Synod will always have the final sign-off. And for this reason, we invite you to reject the amendment. Not to reject the clause, to vote against Mr. Fender's proposal that you should reject it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This item is now open for debate. Gentleman over there. Speech limit of 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Carl Fender, Lincoln 343. If I start with the declaration of interest, I'm a member of the Scrutiny Committee for the Legislative Reform Measure. And I did speak, as you've heard, about the intended removal of the sunset clause in July last year, where I alerted Synod to the reasons for its inclusion. To recap, it was included at the suggestion of one of our Estates Commissioners, who was Dame Caroline Spellman. The clause was included to assuage any concerns Parliament may have had about the use of the legislative reform measure. As you know, the sunset clause operates as an automatic repeal clause unless the LRM is extended by this synod. Under section 10 of the LRM, the Archbishop's Council can order, with the approval of synod, an extension for a fixed or indefinite period. The Archbishop's Council is not the proposer of clause 2 today. I would suggest that the future of the LRM belongs to the Archbishop's Council and its own subcommittee. It is written into the LRM. The LRM is a unique piece of legislation. It can fast-track amendments to our primary legislation, as you know, but there are strict statutory tests for its use and which guard against misuse. There is also a scrutiny committee, of which I'm a member, elected to objectively assess proposals for any amendments to any legislation. Together with the sunset clause, the safeguards embedded within the statutory scheme overall protects us against inappropriate use. The approval sought today effectively is one which will make the LRM available indefinitely. That is obvious. But I would suggest that nowhere in GS 2272Y, which is the main paper on this draft measure, is there any justification for why the statutory procedure in section 10 has not been followed. That is, for the Archbishop's Council to place before Synod an order seeking approval for an extension. Nor is there any exploration of the merits of a time-limited extension versus an indefinite one. There is no consideration given to why the sunset clause was inserted. Given the short life of the LRM so far had, there ought to be some consideration of its likely use in the future. Synod, would that not be a good indicator of the time we should extend it for? None of this is canvassed in the main paper. In short, do we need the LRM, and for what? What work streams are contemplated in the next few years? This is an unnecessary clause of this miscellaneous provisions measure, and I encourage you to vote in favour of its removal. There is a statutory scheme within the LRM itself, and it should be used to justify any extension. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 3 minutes remains, and then Simon Butler.
Stuart Fife, Carlisle, 077, licensed to preach anywhere in the said diocese. I sat on the revision committee for the LRM and have been a staunch supporter of it. I think it's proved its worth over and over again, bringing unaccustomed speed to Synod's proceedings and remarkable efficiency for which we are not generally noted. Synod does, however, for all its virtues, occasionally suffer from a lapse of memory. I speak as a fellow sufferer. And it would be a great shame if this valuable measure were to be lost simply because at some future date the Archbishop's Council or Synod itself forgot about the sunset clause and found that it had simply lapsed. As Mr. Fender says, the sunset clause was originally inserted at the request of Dame Caroline Spellman, who in turn was expressing the view of the Ecclesiastical Committee of Parliament. And the reason for it was simply to build up trust in Synod on behalf of Parliament in the way that we would use it. I think that trust has been built up. It has been shown to have its value. If the Ecclesiastical Committee of Parliament now approves this measure, I think we can be said to have satisfied the test, and the sunset clause is no longer necessary. And let's just not run the risk of losing this valuable measure simply through a lapse of... I've forgotten what I was talking about. Thank you.
I wish everyone was so honest. Simon Butler, followed by Clive Scowen.
Simon Butler, Southwark 221, speaking as chair of the Legislative Reform Committee. I simply want to just aid those newer members of Synod to understand a little bit of the background here. I mean, there was a concern throughout the process of establishing the legislative reform measure that it will be a bit of opportunity for overreach by the Archbishop's Council in respect of wanting to do things that people might be worried we might do. The constraints that have been placed on us by the measure have resulted in a fairly limited set of powers that we can exercise. Indeed, the Dean of the Arches at the time, Charles George, said to me, I think you're going to find it very difficult to do very much with this measure given the way it's been written. So the experience over the last 3 measures has been that we have discovered the limit of our powers, and those of you who remember the debate on the governance of the Church Commissioners will realise that that was an incredibly close vote and that Synod provided itself with an opportunity to express its mind. We as a committee, I think, know the limits of our powers and where we can go with them. And as a result of that, I think the concerns that Mr. Fender has his principled objection all the way through has been the same, that this might be an opportunity for people to take advantage and that the sunset clauses provides protection against that happening from Parliament have proved to be unfounded. And as a result of that, and because gaining parliamentary time is not an easy thing to do, let the hearer understand, we ought to simply allow ourselves to make this decision by use of the measure, which, don't forget, will have to go through the ecclesiastical process in Parliament as well in order to be deemed suitable for not for final approval, but for royal assent. So there will be an opportunity for Parliament to deal with this if they are not happy. So I encourage you to support Mr. Hofmeyr in his proposal.
Clive Scowen.
Scowen, London 358. I mean, I've got 2 concerns about this. I, like Mr. Fender, am a member of the Scrutiny Committee. You won't be surprised to learn. I think this has been a curate's egg, frankly. And some of the stuff that's been done under the measure has been sensible and good. Other things have been out with the scope of what many of us thought we were voting for when we passed the measure in the first place, including what Simon Butler's just referred to on the governance of the Church Commissioners, which is why the vote was so close. Many of us thought it was not the sort of thing that should be done by that means. So I don't think it's an unqualified success. What particularly worries me, and again, Simon Butler's just referred to this, but I think this is a problem. Parliament will have to pass this miscellaneous provisions measure, ultimately, approve it, I should say, and before they can do that, the Ecclesiastical Committee of Parliament has to be satisfied that the measure is expedient. Now, we've already been told that the sunset clause was inserted at the request of the Second Church Estates Commissioner in order to get the legislative reform measure through Parliament at all. Now, we don't know what members of that committee are now going to think about the removal of the sunset clause. But there must be a risk that they'll say, no, we don't want this. And because they can't divide the measure up, it could result in the entire measure being found inexpedient. And if it does that, that's the end of it. You have to go through all this again without the relevant clause. So Synod needs to be aware that given the particular parliamentary interest in this particular provision in the past, there must be a risk that if we leave the deletion of the sunset clause in, that the Ecclesiastical Committee will say no to the whole measure. So it needs to think about that before we vote on this.
Thank you. I now call, seeing no one standing, I now call Mr. Hofmeyr to respond. Oh, no. Yes, I do. Yes, I call Mr. Hofmeyr to respond to the debate, and you have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You've heard the concerns expressed, we are of the view that the level of trust has now been built up to a sufficient degree and that this is an appropriate step forward to take in order to simplify, with General Synod retaining power and authority to the last, in order to simplify in removing unnecessary burdens in legislation. And we would invite you to support the provision being retained. Thank you, Mr. Fender, for your concerns expressed. We have taken those into consideration, but we nevertheless believe that this is the appropriate step to take at this stage, having built up a level of trust, and in order to avoid the procedure of each time having to go to Parliament with a proposal. So for those reasons, we would invite you to resist any suggestion that Clause 2 should not be approved.
Therefore, I put item 523, that Clause 2 stand part of the measure, to Synod. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against, please show. I think we're going to have another counted vote. This is a counted vote of the whole Synod on item 523. Those present at Church House using the voting handsets and who wish to vote in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2. Those who wish to record an abstention should press 3. Those participating remotely should use the online voting platform and vote or register an abstention using the buttons on the screen.
The voting period is now open and will end in 1 minute. There's nothing we can do about that now. The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
There voted in favour 168, against 87, with 37 recorded abstentions, and so Clause 2 does stand part of the measure. We come to item 524, that clauses 3 to 9 stand part of the measure. As no member has indicated an intention... Point of order, Mr. Scowen.
I'd like to move under Standing Order 60 that this measure be considered for further revision in committee in respect of Clause 8, which a number of members expressed concern about earlier.
You clearly have the right to propose that, Clive, and you have the right to speak to Synod. Given that we've got a hard closure, would you be able to do that in 3 minutes, please?
I hope I can do it in considerably less than that. We heard earlier on from Fraser Oates and Matt Beer and Tim Bateman, all of whom are actively involved with Bishop's mission orders and how they operate, of a real concern about the effect of Clause 8. Now, it's unfortunate that that concern wasn't articulated to the Revision Committee earlier, but it is a real concern, and I hope we are all committed in this chamber to the use of Bishop's mission orders to enable and forward the mission of the Church. They have been outstandingly successful in bringing particularly younger people, but not exclusively, to faith and into discipleship. And I think that now this concern has been raised, that it ought to be properly considered. And it will give those involved with the Bishop's mission orders the opportunity to write in and potentially propose amendments to what's proposed. So that's why I think this particular clause does need further consideration before it stands part of the measure.
Thank you very much, Clive. Can I just have an indication, please, of those who would wish to speak, if anyone wishes to speak in a debate on whether it is referred? Could you stand, please, or indicate in the normal way? And Stephen Hoff. Thank you. Because we need to adjourn, what I'm going to suggest, and I know this is not very satisfactory, but given the circumstances, this is all we can do, is that we resume the debate tomorrow, Clive, on what you've just proposed. So if you're able to remember what you were going to do or say, that would be really helpful. And then we continue debating this measure itself tomorrow. So I now adjourn this particular item of business, and we'll resume it tomorrow when the Business Committee tells us when. Thank you.
Can't begin without
Synod, we come now to item 7 on the agenda, the Loyal Address, which will be moved by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Let me just explain how we will then proceed. Following that, there will be opportunity for speeches from the floor, but I have been informed that both the prolocutor and the chair of the House of Laity wish to contribute as well to this session, and they will take precedence over anyone speaking from the floor. So we will deal with that as we get to it, but just so that you know the shape of the events, and there will, of course, be a vote at the end. So I turn now to the Archbishop of Canterbury to speak to item 7. The members of Synod will need NP notice paper 12 for this item, which is available on the app. The Archbishop of Canterbury has up to 10 minutes, but I understand is not likely to take 10 minutes.
I have no idea, Chair, where you got that understanding. Certainly not from me. As the nation, Justin Welby, 1 Canterbury. As the nation prepares to come together this year on May the 6th to celebrate the coronation of His Majesty the King, I wish to begin by reminding us of the tribute we have paid and continue to owe to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Yesterday marked the 71st anniversary of her accession to the throne. Throughout the many years that followed, we were blessed with a shining example of Christian faith and duty, which was recognized and mourned by church, nation, by much of the world last year. We remain encouraged by her discipleship and strengthened by her legacy. And now, over 70 years later, we recommit our service to His Majesty King Charles III. The King reigns in a very different era. The world has changed hugely since 1952. New challenges have emerged, new opportunities have arisen. History has progressed and had its effects. Science and technological developments have been more rapid than any of us could have forecast. Culture has changed. Climate change has become the great threat of our times. We are once more observing a European war. And yet, as the years changed, the steadfast presence of Her late Majesty the Queen was a source of reassurance. And we are fortunate that the same reassurance is now found in His Majesty King Charles III. We know that His Majesty has been extremely prescient with regard to these changes. For many years, he has spoken of the importance of protecting our climate, something which the Prince of Wales has also taken up. He was probably 40 to 50 years ahead of his time in recognizing those threats. Like his beloved father, the Duke of Edinburgh, he has been aware of and fascinated by the potential of scientific and industrial solutions to our modern problems. These are issues of profound importance to the Church of England and above all to the Anglican Communion. Christians around the Communion are at the forefront of climate change, and we remember our brothers and sisters that are in countries that are already bearing its brunt. One of the things I heard this last weekend in South Sudan was the huge areas of the country still covered in water by the enormous floods of earlier this year, stagnant water now giving rise to a malaria epidemic on a scale they have never before experienced. At home, the Church of England maintains an ambitious but necessary net zero carbon by 2030 as its objective. Churches care for the natural environment in their local communities. Christians are working together to protect our planet. And we know also that the King has been extremely active in the interfaith area. And yet, at the same time as drawing others into dialogue from different faiths around the world, he has spoken out passionately for the plight of Christians who are persecuted. Here at home, he has brought together so many of the different faiths and cultures in this country to enable better understanding. This coronation year will be a time to celebrate the culture that he has begun to create and for which we long, of recognizing how difference and diversity make us stronger and the common values that unite us. I have, as has been reported on the news, had several nightmares about things going wrong at the coronation. But I've been inspired and comforted reading about the tips and mistakes of previous archbishops. Archbishop Fisher is said to have kept a flask of brandy with him on the day of the Queen's coronation. Given the service lasted 4 hours, one understands why. Archbishop Lang and the other bishops at the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth perhaps finished their flasks before the ceremony. Archbishop Lang thought the Dean had given him St. Edward's crown the wrong way round. One bishop stepped on the King's train, and another put his thumb over the words of the oath when the King was about to read it. I do look now at the Bishop of Bath and Wells and the Bishop of Durham, because it was one of them. It is a privilege for the Church of England to be at the heart of this momentous event. We remain the only European country where there is a religious coronation. And I know that churches and cathedral churches all over the land will join and lead their local celebrations over that extraordinary weekend. As we gather together to discern the will of God for the Church of England, we take great comfort in knowing for certain that the prayers of His Majesty the King are with us. In turn, we offer our own steadfast prayer, that the Lord might succor and strengthen His Majesty the King and the Queen Consort. May the King be blessed with the wisdom and grace necessary for his reign, as his late mother was in hers. And may he be blessed by the grace as he seeks to point towards the kingdom of heaven, over which the King of Kings reigns eternal, the King for all of us. I move the motion standing in my name.
To make her speech following the loyal address from the Archbishop. And she has 2 minutes. We are facing timed business at 10 to 12, as you will know from your agenda.
Kate Wharton, Liverpool 157. Thank you, Chair. It is, of course, only a very short time, just 7 months, in fact, since we gave a loyal address to Her Majesty the Queen on the occasion of Her late Majesty's Platinum Jubilee. And now we prepare for the coronation of His Majesty the King in just a few months' time. We look forward with joy and gratitude and with hopeful expectation for the years ahead. It was my privilege to meet His Majesty some years ago when he was the Prince of Wales and I was a shiny new curate. Bishop James Jones and the then Prince had decided to run an exciting pilot project in one of the Prince's Trust programmes. A short-term project where a cohort of neat young adults were gathered together and supported to plan and prepare for a different future. They were given access to a whole range of resources and opportunities, supported in changing the outcome that lay ahead. And the success rate was extraordinary. A very high percentage ended up in employment or future education and training. Bishop James and the King are great friends, and they decided that something was missing from these programs. Conversations about life and faith, and so they set about creating a pilot project with a chaplaincy element. I realise this sounds for all the world like the start of a joke, but they invited a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian to accompany the young people for the duration of the programme. It was a privilege to be part of it. We facilitated conversations along the way as we climbed mountains, helped them write job adverts, and then we celebrated with them at the end as we honoured their achievements. His Majesty came to Liverpool towards the end of that pilot project to meet with Bishop James and with me, Svea and Zia, the chaplains. I was extraordinarily impressed and moved by the King's passion for the project, not just for the Prince's trust in the abstract, but for this one small programme with a gang of funny, grumpy, sweary teenagers from Bootle. I hope it's neither irreverent nor treasonous to say this.
Your time has come
You
to
can't
an
leave me on that line, Joyce. But in that conversation, there was no difference between the Muslim, the Jew, the Christian, the bishop, the prince, and the commoners. Faith mattered to us all.
Thank you. I now call upon Jamie Harrison as the chair of the House of Laity to make a speech. It would be helpful if you could do it in 1 minute, please.
Jamie Harrison, Durham 301, Madam Chair. With the passing over of our lovely Queen, the handing on of the baton of monarchy, we see much continuity, but also many new possibilities. His Majesty, as we've heard, has long challenged us about the effects of climate change, the need to protect nature, championing the needs of young people, open to those not in the mainstream, aware of those who have a different faith from him and from ourselves. It must therefore be our prayer to ask God to continue to bless and inspire our new monarch and the Queen Consort. As we heard last night, we've changed our evensong liturgy to, O Lord, save the King. And we still respond, though, with, and mercifully hear us as we call upon thee. So that as God hears us, we must at the same time be asking that our King should know the salvation that comes from the living God.
I call upon the Archbishop of Canterbury to respond. I am sorry that we cannot take any comments from the floor, but it's simply not possible.
Thank you for those two contributions, which were very valuable. I'm sure there are many that could have been made from the floor.
And I now put item 7 to the vote. This can be done by a show of hands and by those on Zoom using the green ticks. So all those in favour, please show. All those against, please show. Thank you. That concludes this item of business.
That's fine.
We now come to item 8, questions. Synod members will need questions notice paper 2 for this session. All the questions for this session relate to LLF. I would like to just remind Synod that any supplementary questions must be questions. They must not ask for an opinion, and they need to be able to be answered by facts. Thank you. Question 143. Yes.
Thank you, Bishop Sarah, for your consideration. And may I please ask that while we wait for the new pastoral guidance, what should the Church be teaching in our youth groups and schools about the Church of England's position on sexual activity and marriage, given that the age of consent remains at 16, when the Act of Parliament raises the age of marriage and civil partnerships to 18, and this takes effect on the 27th of this month? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'm very aware of the very good work that already goes on in our schools and with our youth workers. And of course, the teaching of those things that we value in holy matrimony are the things that they pass on around lifelong partnerships, also around honouring each other in that way. So certainly, in a sense, teaching what already is teaching at the root of what is central to holy matrimony is what I would expect to continue.
Thank you.
Question 144. Sam Margrave.
Sam Margrave, Coventry 295. At the press conference 2 weeks ago on LLF, the Bishop of London said that the prayers offered are to mark stages of a relationship outside of marriage, and that the relationship will be blessed, and some of these relationships will be sexual in nature. For clarity, as it is not clear from this answer or the previous answer in November.
What is your question?
So this question, what is the theological position, the decided and agreed theological position on the blessing of sexual relationships outside of Canon B30? Is the position of the House of Bishops that it is a sin or it is not a sin? Yes or no will do, Bishop. Thank you.
The issue around the pastoral guidance and the prayers of blessings are silent on issues of sexual intimacy, and they will be considered as part of the pastoral guidance. Thank you, Sam.
Yes, Clive Scowen.
Let's go in London 358. I wonder, has the House considered how the silence of the prayers on the question of sexual intimacy, which the Bishop has just referred to, how that works with the pastoral principle that we should speak into silence?
Thank you, Clive, for your question. This afternoon, there is a session which I'm sure you will be at, that is an opportunity for the House of Bishops to listen to both the views around the pastoral guidance and also on the prayers. And we very much look forward to hearing the voices and comments of people, and we will respond to that.
Question 145.
Supplementary.
Yes.
Sam Margrave, Coventry 295. While not all pride is sexualised, there is evidence of sexual content. Sorry about this, that's never happened before. There is evidence of sexual content on our streets that would not be allowed on TV before 9 p.m. And there is evidence of sexualisation and grooming of children at Pride. This is my question, Chair. There is evidence of sexualisation and grooming of children at some Pride events. What is the House of Bishops doing to protect children from that sexualisation at Pride or from queer theory? Thank you.
That does not relate to the question, the original question, I'm afraid.
It does. It's about the Bishop's position on Pride, Chair, and whether they're protecting children from Pride. They should have a position and be able to tell me. Because you don't want to protect children and you dare not speak against Pride or queer theory. Shame on you.
Please sit down. Question 146. Yes.
Leslie Seuss, Ed's Notes 209. Thanks, Bishop, and I know this is hard. As well as the canons of the Church, which you mentioned in your answer, The doctrine of holy matrimony and right to sexual relationships is articulated elsewhere, catechism, homilies, marriage service itself. What consideration has the House of Bishops given to those texts and whether they continue to apply today and as we look ahead to the development of pastoral guidance? Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for your question. The House of Bishops considered a whole range of material, including some of those that you included in your answer. And as I say at the moment, that the doctrine of holy matrimony has not changed.
Yes, go ahead.
Ros Clark, Lichfield 336. The questions and answers here talk about sexual activity. In the bishop's proposals and pastoral prayers, it talks about sexual intimacy. I wonder if you could tell me whether the House of Bishops have a definition of sexual intimacy, and if and how that might differ from sexual activity.
Thank you, Ros, for your question. I think that the issue of sexual intimacy is something that we, not just as the House of Bishops, but as Synod, will need to contend with. And it is further work that we expect to do as part of the pastoral principles. Thank you.
Question 147.
Thank you. In the light of the Bishop's answer, will the House of Bishops consider, when refining the prayers of love and faith, introducing a rubric making it clear that the prayers may not be used to indicate or imply affirmation of sexually active relationships out with holy matrimony, or to invoke God's blessing on such relationships?
Thank you, Clive, for your comment, and I will take that back. It will be also helpful for you to reiterate that comment in the group work this afternoon.
Oh, I will, Bishop, I will.
Question 148. Yes.
Daniel Matavu, Oxford 379. Thank you, Bishop Sarah, for your answer, but unfortunately it wasn't to my question. In their deliberations, the bishops must have appreciated and considered the fact that many, if not most, same-sex couples will be in an intimate sexual relationship. My question is this: are the bishops commending the use of these prayers for all same-sex couples, including those engaged in an active sexual relationship, or only for those who are celibate? In other words, are the bishops accepting that it will be permissible to be in an active sexual relationship as a same-sex couple and appropriate for such a couple to receive God's blessing?
Thank you, Daniel, for your question. I think I think listening through the Living Love and Faith programme and listening to all the voices that we heard, I think that one of the things that we have learned as a House of Bishops is that there are many different types of relationships, and therefore it would be wrong for us to categorise in the way that you suggested around most. As we say, in terms of the issue around sexual intimacy, the prayers at this stage are silent and further work needs to be done. Thank you.
Sorry, is it possible to answer the question as to whether they're intended for all same-sex?
You've asked your question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Question 149.
Supplementary.
Yes.
Bishop Sarah, thank you very much for your answer. Given that the documentation that was quoted in the question is actually entirely unambiguous, I wonder if you could just clarify the nature of the, quote, disagreement in the Church about how the teaching applies today. Is there disagreement about how it applies, or is it disagreement about whether these documents still apply?
Sorry, Ian, I'm lost. You're going to have to tell me the document you're talking.
So is this question 149, am I correct? So the documents listed there are the position set out in the 2005 House of Bishops statement.
All right, sorry, yeah, I've got
citation
it now.
of marriage, 1999.
Yes, sorry, I didn't see the list. Yeah, so can you repeat your question? I apologise.
Yes. Given that the statements within these documents repeatedly is entirely unambiguous about the nature of the application, could you clarify the nature of the disagreement in the Church about how they apply? And in particular, could you clarify whether this is a disagreement about the nature of the application or whether this is disagreement about whether these documents still apply.
No, I think there is agreement, as I've already said, that these documents still apply. I think the disagreement is in terms of responding pastorally, our pastoral response in terms of the future around what that is.
Question 150. Question 151. Yes.
Mary Durlacher, Chelmsford, 252. Given the importance of this subject, thank you, silence is not always golden, and can we be given some indication of exactly how you intend to investigate properly the issue of true teaching, received teaching? Because these documents that you refer to are not within the reach of most ordinary parishes and PCCs.
What the Living in Love and Faith programme tried to do was to engage people in conversation, both around theology and scripture, as well as listening to people's story. On the LLF Hub, there is a whole wealth of information available that is in a very accessible form in the Living in Love and Faith document, as well as a series of videos and podcasts, as well as a resource library of different views and different opinions. That is made available, and through the course, I think it was made very accessible for people to engage both with each other and with this material. And I'm very grateful for those that have done that, and the House of Bishops have also engaged in that way. Thank you.
Question 152. Yes, go ahead.
Stephen Hoffmeyer, Guildford 320. Thank you for the answer to my question. Under what provision was it authorised?
I would have to get back to you with about that question.
Thank you so much. That's very kind.
I assume you're talking about common worship marriage service.
I am, yes.
Thank you. That's the it. Thank you.
Question 153.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Simon Butler, Southwark 152. Chair, before I ask my question, could I just ask you from the Chair if you might just remind people to keep the tone of their questions a bit less aggressive than they seem to be at the moment.
Thank you. I do endorse that view.
Could I ask you, Bishop Sarah, given that this is a novel idea and it's a process being worked out, to remind you and Synod that we do have a document, once was a discussion document that became a policy. It was called Issues in Human Sexuality, and you may have heard of it. At this time, can you confirm that this distinction is not one that is the policy or position of the House of Bishops?
I think, I mean, it's not a policy, but I think what we're trying to say is the Act of 2013 raised issues that probably should have been discussed at the time. And in a sense, in Living in Love and Faith, it has raised them again, and maybe we're better equipped to look at it.
Question 154.
Supplementary.
Yes.
Leslie Sue, said NEPS 209. Thank you again. You mentioned the 2013 Act. A legal exemption was made, so the Church of England would not be required or able to solemnise same-sex marriages. Has consideration been given as to whether the proposed prayers of love and faith will undermine that ongoing, the plausibility of that legal exemption? And if so, what concerns were identified? Thank you.
So we did consider around the nature of prayers, and our view is that that does not change the doctrine of holy marriage, and the doctrine remains the same. And because of the difference in view in the House around same-sex marriage, we are not pushing that at this time.
Question 155.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Timothy Edwards, Rochester 200. Thank you, Bishop, for the clarity of your answer, and thank you very much. Appreciate that you have in many ways drawn the short straw by being the person who has to respond to all
I'm
these.
not sure about that.
Can I ask, given that you have so helpfully clarified that that the doctrine and teaching of the Church is not intended to change, what consideration has the House or College of Bishops given so far to how to ensure continuity with previous statements from the House and College of Bishops in terms of the application of that teaching?
So I think in our reflections, we have been very mindful of those statements. I think what we've also heard already in this synod, and we've heard in these questions, that there is still more work to do, particularly around the nature of sexual intimacy. So we have seen the continuity, but I think there is further work to do.
Thank you.
Question 156. Yes, go ahead.
Richard Deno, 348 Liverpool. Thank you, Bishop Sarah, for your reply to my question and for pointing us to the need to be neither contrary to nor indicative of any departure from the doctrine of the Church of England. And the second half of my question was using a similar language of travel, where I said, has the House of Bishops considered calling for a return to the teaching contained in Holy Scripture and calling a halt to any false teaching?
I think the House of Bishops in our time takes very seriously both Holy Scripture and its teaching. We have engaged in the wrestling with Scripture. And you will know that within this synod, there will be people will prayerfully study Scripture, and they will come up with a different view on it. And therefore, that's important for us to listen to each other in that way, which is what we have been seeking to do, is to listen to each other. But also, we take very seriously our role as being teachers of the faith and teachers of Scripture.
Question 157.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, May Christie, Southwark 222. Thank you so much for this really helpful answer, and we look forward to hearing the new pastoral guidance, to reading it. The related question that I had was whether or not the new pastoral guidance will touch on the possibility of Church of England clergy and license holders getting married in churches around the Anglican Communion and same-sex marriages, particularly in Scotland, for instance.
It will consider that.
Question 158. Question 159. Question 160. 161. 162.
Supplementary.
Yes, May Christie first.
May Christie, Southwark 222. This question was helpfully put to me by the ordinands of Westcott House, who are watching this on live stream in the college common room, which I think is just about the geekiest and loveliest thing I've ever heard of in my life. And they ask this really important question: will ordinands already in training at the time of the new pastoral guidance's submission be asked to engage with it in the way that the bishop describes? So those that are already in training, who have already in some way had to assent to issues in human sexuality.
When the guidance is produced, it won't look like a book that people have to sign up to. It will be much more, in a sense, around those things that some of us may understand as policy, and therefore it will be interwoven into discernment processes, and therefore it will be interwoven almost certainly. It will be interwoven in a way in which that will fit those different stages of a discernment process. And what I will do is look to those in the ministry division to enable to say, well, how does that fit at certain times? Because all of us will know in our discernment process we are asked different questions at different times, but sometimes they are repeated. And so the working out of the pastoral guidance will need to come through collaboration with the ministry division.
Supplementary.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Sam Margrave, Coventry 295. As the current mechanism is being withdrawn, how will bishops ensure that those they are sponsoring are living a moral and godly life in respect of sexual behaviour?
That's the purpose of the pastoral guidance. Question 163. Yes, go ahead.
Christopher Townsend, Ely 305. Thank you, Bishop. My question concerns relationships which are neither civil marriage nor civil partnerships, but are relationships of cohabitation and sexual intimacy. Can the Bishop confirm that at the present time, the House of Bishops has not reached a settled mind on whether the prayers of love and faith should be made available to couples in such a relationship?
I think that would be, we have not reached a settled mind.
Thank you.
Question 164.
Supplementary?
Yes, go ahead.
Rebecca Hunt, Portsmouth 386. Thank you for the answer to the question. Please could you help me with this? If the prayers may be used for a man and a woman who have just moved in together, how will the bishops make sure that use of the prayers in that way will not undermine Canon B30 and our doctrine of marriage?
So I think that will be part of the pastoral guidance, but I think it's probably important for us to say that in our discussions as a house, we have always underlined the need for permanent, faithful, stable, committed relationships between two people. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandy Turner,
Yes,
Chelmsford 275. Slightly following on from what we've just heard, thank you very much for your response to my question. Could the consultative group consider giving really clear clarification and guidance over what does mark a significant stage in a relationship, so that clergy avoid inadvertently offering prayers for a non-married couple for whom sexual intimacy may indeed be that significant stage they wish to mark?
It can. Question 165. 166. Yes, go ahead.
Can't remember whether this is 165 or 166.
Which one are you talking to?
I'm speaking to the one that refers to the House of Bishops. It is 166. 166 is what I'm talking about.
Right, thank you.
The answer says that when the new pastoral guidance has been finalised and approved by the House of Bishops, issues in human sexuality will be rescinded. It's hoped this will be in July 2023. In the light of the statement from the Next Steps group last week, are we now to read that as following consideration of the guidance by Synod in July 2023?
So I think we hope that it will be rescinded by July 2023, and I think we're waiting to hear the discussion that occurs in the rest of Synod.
So we're not going to get it in July?
You've had your question, I'm afraid. Question 167. 16. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't plan to do this. Chantal Nopman, 108 Durham. Could you just confirm that there would be plans to put clear safeguards in place for those who feel that this hasn't been their experience, please?
Yes.
Question 168.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Robin Hall, Europe 307. Thank you, Bishop Sarah. To ensure the apology is more than just a gesture, what will be done to extend an individual apology to those priests who have suffered these consequences, and where appropriate, to compensate them for loss of home and income?
I don't think I can answer that, actually, just because I don't think I have the ability to. So I'll come back to you.
Okay, thank you.
He asked my question.
Okay, thank you.
Same answer.
Question 169.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Joe Hawes, Deans 54. Thank you, Bishop Sarah, for your response. Given the very tight timescales expected in the drawing up of the pastoral guidelines, and indeed that one understands the House of Bishops are to hear back by March, so that July Synod can be briefed. What reassurance can you give General Synod that the voices of those who've suffered the strictures of issues in human sexuality will truly be heard and listened to, given that tight timescale?
So I think one of the very deep lessons that we have had is around how we listen to voices and ensure the makeup of our groups are right for the task ahead. So we are going to take that seriously. As soon as the membership of the Pastoral Consultative Group is known, we will make that public. And I'm sure people who have concerns about representation on it will let me know.
Thank you.
Question 170.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Bishop, for your answer, and especially for the reassurance about being as transparent as possible with this process. I just wondered whether the House of Bishops had actually had an opportunity to determine the timetable for appointing members of the group, and if not, when you might be able to tell us when things are going to happen.
So we would hope that the Pastoral Advisory Group were appointed as soon and made public as soon as possible, but I can't give you the specific timescale.
Question 171.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Chris Gill, Lichfield 338. Thank you for your answer, Archbishop, outlining some of the options for discipline. In the process of discernment of diocesan and suffragan bishops, are candidates asked whether they personally believe and are prepared to teach the doctrines of the Church and the Church's teaching?
That's not directly related to the question that was originally asked. I'm sorry, it's out of order. Yes, go ahead.
Ben John, St Albans 395. Could you, history, has this always been the case that bishops are expected simply to teach it's the official position of the Church of England and not contradict it? So has that always been the case, or was there a time where bishops were expected to believe and uphold the teaching? Is there a shift change there? Sorry if that's confusing.
It's very confusing. Sorry, I'm a bearer of slight brain. Could you just say it again in a way that I can understand exactly what you're asking?
I may have misunderstood the answer. It appears to be that bishops are not expected to believe and uphold the official positions of the Church of England simply to teach that it is the official position of the Church of England. Has that always been the case, or has that changed over time?
Well, I'm rather inclined to go back to Elizabeth I's comment that we're not going to try and put windows into, well, she said, men's souls. So when someone says this is the teaching, I always assume that they believe it to be correct. I can't tell unless they say that if they say this is the teaching, but I think it's rubbish, then you know. But in the absence of them making it clear that they don't believe it, I assume they believe it.
Question 172. Question 173. Question 174.
I didn't get any more.
Question 175. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Lucy Doherty, Portsmouth 385. Thank you, Bishop Sarah, for your response to my question. Could I ask, once the prayers for love and faith have been drafted, what scope will there be for some piloting of these prayers in different parish settings before they receive final approval?
Thank you very much for that suggestion. I think that will be one of the suggestions which we hear from this synod and consider in the redrafting process in the House of Bishops.
Question 176. Yes, go ahead.
Andrew Atherstone, Oxford 183. Thank you for the very full and comprehensive details you've supplied on the notice board. Bishop Sarah told us yesterday that the prayers of love and faith don't change the Church's doctrine because, to quote, they don't use any of the liturgical material of the Church of England's authorised services of marriage. Your answer shows that many of the prayers are in fact borrowed directly from our marriage liturgies. Please could you help us to reconcile these apparently contradictory statements?
Thank you. Well, to give an example, as you know, the Common Worship marriage service includes a wide, provision of prayers, many of them optional in use. For example, one of the prayers as posted, which does derive from Common Worship, the marriage service, the prayer for grace to live well, simply asks for God to give two people wisdom and devotion in the ordering of their common life, asking that they may live together in love and peace, support one another in their various needs. It seems to me that a prayer like that is one which certainly could be prayed by any couple sharing a common life. It's not central to the marriage service, but it is part of the suite of prayers included in the marriage service. Thank you.
Question 177.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for your initial response, Bishop. Oh yeah, Matt or Batham Wells 248. Thank you for your initial response. Just to clarify, whilst it may be complicated to conclude that there is a definitive correlation, statistical evidence would suggest that there is some form of correlation between such decisions and a decline in church attendance, especially here in the UK. Given the Anglican Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia, as referenced, is not an example of growth, which Anglican provinces or alternative denominations who've made such decisions that were considered by the bishops are statistically growing?
I think that there is. I'm surprised that there is any research in the UK. The research we did look at in the Anglican Communion, which is available on the LLF website, more indicated that when there was a change, actually the challenge about if there was decline, it was related to the way in which it was implemented, not necessarily that it was.
Thank you.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for the answer here. Sam Wilson, Chester 282. Does the House of Bishops have any plans to commission research in these provinces in the Church of England to see what the impact of the Bishop's proposals will be?
So there is some research around the impacts on the church making decision regarding sexuality and marriage, and it is, and we did commission it, and it is on the LLF website. It's linked in question 178.
Question 178.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Nick Land, York, 437. Thank you very much for your answer, Bishop Sarah. As you know, we do risk assessments to mitigate adverse impacts. So before knowing the proposals, I think it was very difficult for dioceses to do detailed risk assessments, which is why I wrote to every member of the College of Bishops pleading that we have a risk assessment prior to any
Could you
proposals
ask your question?
coming. Why did you decide not to do this, particularly given your answer to 177?
The House of Bishops did not make a decision on this in this way. I think that was, if you wrote to individual bishops, it was up to individual bishops to make those decisions within their diocese. And as I think the response I've said somewhere, some have done that.
Question 179. Question 180.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Gavin Kirk, Lincoln 151. Thank you, Bishop, for this answer. Could you share with Synod how the House of Bishops has honoured those who feel called to celibacy, and how is it planning to support them in the future?
Thank you very much for what is a very important question. In the document that we've produced, I can't remember what the General Synod number is, but we have highlighted it. There are things that we need to pay more attention to, and one of them is celibacy. And I think that there is further work for us to do to attend to this, and also to make sure that there is the appropriate pastoral support for people in place that choose this life.
Question 181.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Andrew Bell, 374 Oxford. Thank you very much for your reply and for the welcome assurance that clergy wellbeing will be considered, specifically as the pastoral guidance is drafted. May I make my question a little more specific? I ask it on behalf of concerned clergy. Has the House of Bishops considered the effect on clergy of the risk that those who do choose to use the prayers of love and faith may open themselves to a complaint under the clergy discipline measure, while those who decline to use them may open themselves to a claim of discrimination?
Yes, we have, and part of the pastoral guidance will be to be very clear about the protections that are put in place in that case. We're very aware of that concern.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Mark Bennett, Oxford 184. As well as those personal aspects, many of us are leading churches that may become divided as a result of this synod decision. And that may also have an impact on clergy well-being. Will the pastoral guidance help those of us in such situations?
It will. The other thing I would encourage is for people to use the material already available for LLF, both in terms of the pastoral principles and also the work that's been put together around facilitating. All of those tools recognise that these issues raise very difficult issues for us and difficult experiences in our congregation. So there is already a wealth of material available to help clergy and church wardens and PCCs.
Question 182.
Supplementary.
Yes, go ahead.
Sam Margrave, Coventry 295. Does the language and rhetoric referred to include an apology for saying that gay sex is a sin?
That's asking
I don't
for an
think
opinion.
I don't. What, sorry?
That's asking for an opinion.
Yeah, thank you.
That's out of order. Supplementary, go ahead.
Simon Butler, Southwark 221. Moving beyond this immediate process, what plans do the House of Bishops have to ensure that there are robust ways of challenging homophobia in dioceses, given our historic commitments to stand against racism and gender inequality?
Thank you, Simon, for what I think is a really important question. So I do think that more work needs to be done. I think there's work for us to attend to understand what is bad behaviour, regardless of our theology. And I think that living in love and faith, in terms of enabling us to listen to other people, began to enable us to hear where our bad behaviour is homophobic. So I absolutely agree with you. I think there is work to do that says what is a healthy, safe environment for people, in a sense, regardless of our theology.
Thank you, Synod. This ends item 8. I do have a short notice to read. I wish to inform Synod that between 1 and 1:20 there will be a Zoom meeting to pray for a doubling of the number of children and young active disciples in the Church of England by 2030. This takes place every Tuesday lunchtime, and members are invited to join this. This will take place in the chamber, and for those on Zoom, a separate Zoom link has been sent out. Thank you. We now adjourn for lunch.